We're talking once again with writer, journalist Jim Sullivan, who's written about music for several different publications, mostly for the Boston Globe over the years. And we're talking about his book, Backstage and Beyond. Last time we talked, it was Volume 1, which covered some, rockers from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Volume 2 here, which just came out, picks up there with what some would call the birth of punk or new wave in the late 70s, moving through the 80s. And I know last time we started with Lou Reed because I was amazed. Lou Reed is a notorious difficult interview, and you had a pretty easy time. And this time you talked to another notoriously difficult interview subject, and that is Johnny Rotten or Johnny Lydon from the Sex Pistols and Public Image. And again, I have to ask, did he take any shots at you? And what was it that it seemed like he was pretty civil with you? What was it that was it something specific that made him act like that towards you?
I think with Johnny, it was civil, yes, but also, confrontational, but in an intelligent way. And by that I mean it could go either way. I mean, I could confront him with a question, and he would come back with a good answer, a sharp answer perhaps. And, there was a back and forth that was quite easy to do in a way. I think part of that is shared sense of humor, irony, and perspective. And I think, he knew that I knew what I was talking about or asking about. And there was no intimidation, I guess, on my end of it because he's my age. He certainly came to quite a degree of fame, especially in England. But didn't wear it as a rock star. I mean, punks weren't rock stars in the beginning at all. And he was very approachable that way. I mean, the first time I met him, I saw them at the Pistols in Atlanta, the first show they did, just by happenstance, actually. That's a story in the book. But the first time I actually talked to him was with Public Image Limited when they played Boston. And I was doing a story for, believe it or not, USA Today. I freelanced a few things for them back then. And, when Johnny and I met, he said, "You can come in. I don't bite." And it was good. It was sort of like he was aware that his public image, if you will, was sharp and abrasive and intimidating, and it was kind of a nice, in a way, kind of a nice warm welcome. Like, okay, fine, let's just sit here and talk. And he was with his wife Nora at the time too, who late wife now, who he loves very much, and I think that makes the situation even more easy to do. And there were many times since on the phone and in person, and we just got on well.
Had a chance to interview him once. It was by phone, and I was really nervous because of his reputation. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to go both barrels right off, and if he's going to hang up on me, he's going to hang up on me. So I just, he did those butter commercials. You remember those?
Yes, of course. Oh, so, very much.
Yeah, so
I loved it. I chided him about that for sure. Yeah.
So he gets on the phone. I said, well, my first question to you is, does country crock butter or whatever it was called actually taste like real butter? And there was this silence. I'm like, that's it. I lost him. And he came back and goes, what? It actually does. And then he went on to explain in a very civil way why he was doing those commercials because of all the lawsuits and he wasn't able to make money and everything. And so I think you've got a sense of humor. Maybe they have a sense of humor. That's the key to opening people up for an interview like that.
It often is. I mean, I speak about this some in the book, and I've talked to people about this. The idea is to try to find whatever wavelength the person is on, and do your research ahead of time. Maybe get an idea of where they're coming from or might be coming from, and in doing that, yes, humor I think is a pretty key component. Not that you want to make it a yuck fest, but you want to. Yes, suggest that you have a sense of humor, and by implication, there's pretty good chance they do as well. And you're right about that butter commercial thing. I talked to him about the same thing, and that was it. It was sort of like, no, I'm not embarrassed at all. We needed the money, to make the records. And this is an entity he wanted to keep going. And if they were going to drop a pile of money in his lap to do that commercial, fine, Yeah. And it was a pragmatic decision, and I kind of went into it thinking, John, you sold out. I kind of came out of it thinking, like, it's just good business sense. It doesn't even harm you, and it's fun. And if people make fun of you, so what?
Right, you're still doing what he's still being. He's still able to do what he does, which he loves, obviously, and
right.
Yeah.
It facilitated the band keeping on, basically.
Right.
And, that was his rationale. It worked. Face it. I mean, he was kind of in the early phase of rock people or punk people doing ads, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been different waves of it throughout time, but, back, I think, when he did it was like, oh, my God, no, not a punk rocker selling something. And it's like, well, that's happened a lot.
That's become more accepted now. I mean, it's become actually... Yeah. The bands do it, and they do it so they can have a little more autonomy over their creativity. Bands like Black Keys and stuff, they're all over commercials. Moby was all over commercials, but it gives them freedom.
It brings in a lot of money, let's face it. And as we all know, streaming does not pay very well. CDs barely exist. LPs may sell some, but, to the cognoscenti. And the money's made by touring, selling merchandise, and licensing songs to commercials. It's a key part now of how a band exists or thrives. And, we kind of have to accept that and just go, yeah, okay, fine.
Reading through Backstage and Beyond, Volume 2, you talk about, not just the Pistols, the Ramones, the Cure, the Beastie Boys, Talking Heads. A lot of these bands, I think we were at the same shows. I was definitely at that U2 show at the Centrum in '83 when you're talking to Bono in the book. And I think that was my first time seeing them. Another one was the Palladium here in Worcester, where Joe Strummer came in 2001, a month after the September 11th attacks. I just got to say, I'm so happy someone was there to document that, because it was an amazing night. I'm a huge Clash fan. It was great I'd seen him before, but a month after the September 11th attacks, and people were still scared. People were still nervous.
Yes.
And going into the Palladium, and, Joe could have got up there and played Washington Bullets and Charlie Don't Surf and kind of said, I told you so, and all this stuff. But he didn't. He kind of turned the Mescaleros, to me, into like a bar band. And he's like, okay, we got to get these people dancing and forget about everything for a couple hours.
One of the cool things, I think, Mike, too, was that, just from the start, took the stage, and what was hanging up behind them was the large U.S. flag. And they began the show with an instrumental Irish traditional song called The Minstrel Boy. And that was a tune that had been played at many of the funeral services for the New York firefighters who were killed in the attacks. And that was a pretty good signal that, okay, we're with you here. And I agree with you. It was, it wasn't a confrontational, hard Clash-ish set or anything like that. And I think really one of the sweet parts, too, was the way it ended with doing the Ramones Blitzkrieg Bop.
Yeah.
And the sense of, if you will, the optimism in that song, even if there's cartoon violent imagery, it's still basically just an upbeat song. And, it was fun. They doubled the length. They played it for like 4 minutes or something like that. And I read that as a tribute to, well, both the New York's first responders and the first New York punk band, in a way. It was kind of a good bracketing device, I thought, from beginning to end. And it was a very warm show and very rhythmic and very danceable and very upbeat and very needed. You're right. A month after 9/11, it was like, man, we need something here, and Joe provided, definitely.
Now, did you talk to him at that show?
I did.
If I could, I want to ask you one thing, if he mentioned this, because I was working at WAAF at the time, and I was working on the morning show, and our midday person, Mistress Carey, came into my office and said, hey, someone just called me and said Joe Strummer was on Main Street in Worcester handing out flyers to his show. I was like, shut up. He's not doing that. But then I saw that documentary, The Future is Unwritten, and he was doing that on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And I was like, oh, maybe he was out on Main Street. Did he mention that to you at all?
He did not, and I don't really recall. It was funny because when I went backstage afterwards, and it was not an interview situation. I wasn't taking notes. I didn't have a tape recorder. It was really just to say hi and thanks for doing it. So I don't have a deep recollection of what we talked about. It was just shot the breeze for 5 minutes or something like that, I think. But no, I'm sure that story is correct. And it's I suppose somebody could say, isn't that deeply ironic having a star of Joe's celebrity status pass out his own flyers? Nah, it's also who he was.
Yeah.
Meet the people, encourage people to go to the show, and let's face it too. He was building up the band, the Mescaleros. I mean, it didn't have the star power of the Clash or the catalog of the Clash, but it was what he was into, what he was doing, and he wanted people to still pay attention, and well, they should. It was a good thing. There's one thing in the book too that's interesting. That chapter is kind of a coda. I became friends with a guy named George Burnett, who went to Boston University but has been in London for a long, long time and has a lot of English accent now. We had dinner last year. He was visiting, early this year, and he had gone to the show where the last show, Strummer and Mick Jones played together. It was a Mescaleros show, and George is a good writer, and I said, look, can you throw some things at me about what that was all about? And he was great. He chipped in, and basically he's got the final word in that chapter, and about how wonderful and warm it was to see those guys back together one last time. I think he said I was in rapture.
Yeah, that must have been amazing.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to ask about is, have you ever been in this situation, I'm sure you have, where before the interview begins, a manager will walk up to you and say, listen, don't ask him about drugs, don't ask him about this, don't ask him about the scandal. Do you listen to the manager, or do you go ahead and ask it anyway? Because that's what people want to hear about.
Oddly enough, that really hasn't happened with me, and part of that is just kind of the journalistic rule of we don't accept rules. We don't accept the idea that there are things that you can and can't talk about. So, no, I really haven't had that. I mean, in my world, have you had that?
Yeah,
frequently.
all the time.
Have you?
All the time, and
okay.
It depends what's happening. Like if it's something like I got, every time I talked to, like years ago, every time I talked to a member of Guns N' Roses, I had to ask, are you guys going to get the band back together? And they would always give the same answer. So it's like questions where I wouldn't be doing my job. I mean, a great example though, I used to work with a guy named John Osterland. And he had Stone Temple Pilots coming in during his show to play acoustic, and Scott Weiland had just gotten out of jail that first time. And so the manager comes in and goes right up to John, and he goes, listen, don't ask him about prison and don't ask him about drugs. And John was like, you got it, no problem. So they come in, everyone sits down, he turns the mic on, and the first thing John asks is, Scott, is prison a good place to kick drugs? And you could see the manager just put his head down. You couldn't see his face, but you knew he was just seething. And Scott Weiland was just like, you know what, it's not. And he explained why in a very calm and very polite way. I don't know if it was the manager just looking out, but it's kind of like that John Lydon thing. I'm going to open with this and see what happens.
Right, right. It can be a good ploy sometimes. Oh, it worked well. That sounds like a good, good situation that worked out.
Have you ever gone into an interview expecting a person to be a certain way and then being totally surprised? Like for instance, I interviewed Frank Black from the Pixies. I thought he was going to be this kind of arty, soft-spoken, shy guy, maybe wearing a veil. I don't know. Just the impression I get from him and his music. But when I talked to him, he couldn't have been more of a normal guy. He could have been like my neighbor. We talked about how we like to eat pork and Star Trek and stuff like this. I was like, wow, he's a real normal dude. He's not this crazy, emotionally damaged person he's singing about. Have you ever gone into an interview like that and it was totally unexpected the way the person was?
I don't think so much. Again, I'm looking through right now, just looking through some of the chapters in the new book and going, knew these people pretty well going in. So I'm trying to think of first meetings that might have been somewhere where something unexpected came up. But in all honesty, I mean, I really had a situation where it was pretty copacetic, and I think I had a pretty good idea of where that person was coming from, even if there was a certain abrasiveness built into who they were, like Mark E. Smith of the Fall, for instance, or Shane McGowan of the Pogues. We had good talks. But again, with an edge to it, and with some humor, and taking the mickey here and there, and so I didn't. Those things were not unexpected, and in fact, kind of welcomed. I mean, I love it when things get a little bit, I don't know, not hot, but just where the engagement is not just kind of easy peasy. That there's
Right.
a little bit of grit to it, and a little bit of push and pull. That can be some of the most fun. It was that way with Morrissey actually too. Where when I spoke with him, he was sort of early into his post-Smith solo career, and he had not yet become the, shall we say, the person he is today, who
Right.
I have very little respect for, and would advise everybody to go punch up that Simpsons episode where he's well parodied. Really do that. It's pretty hilarious.
Yes.
But this was a case of, I was certainly aware of his prickly reputation back then, but, we kind of had fun. And even in the talking about him and his veganism, vegetarianism, and he chided me about, do you eat meat? I said, yeah, I eat meat. Do you have pets? Yeah, I have cats. Well, then you're a hypocrite. I said, no, kind of went on a bit. And I said, wait a minute, what are you wearing on your feet? What are those, leather shoes? Yeah.
Yes.
Why not rubber or plastic?
Right.
Why leather? And said, well, it's cold outside. And,
Stop
and then
it.
he kind of went,
Stop.
and then he went into something about, well, I don't ask people to be perfect,
Oh, really?
It was... Yeah, it was kind of, but it was fun. Again, it was the element of confrontation was there, but there was also sort of a friendly banter element as well. I'm sure it wouldn't be that way today. I probably wouldn't want to talk to him at all today, but back then it was.
I couldn't stand him back. I'm one of the 3 people who just don't like the Smiths. Actually, that's not true. I think the Smiths, when they start playing, they are the greatest band in the world until Morrissey opens his mouth. And then I just want to punch him in the neck and tell him to shut up. So I can't even imagine talking to him now. I hate him even more now. So, it would probably just be the same reaction.
No, did you read the Morrissey chapter? Did you get to that yet?
No, and I'd probably save it for last just because of the way I feel. Yeah. I'm just like... No,
you should... I think you'd enjoy it. That's
okay.
Because of that. I mean, it's sort of like, okay, all right, here's someone I really don't like. Let's see what happens here. So, I get it.
So when the Ramones' first album came out, how old were you, if you don't mind me asking?
No. Let's see. If that came out in 1976, I would have been 20.
Okay. So you're fully aware at this time. See, in 76, I was 8. All right? So I was still listening to Disney records. Mm-hmm. So that you were there at the birth of a genre of music, of the birth of what punk or new wave, whatever you want to call it. And then I always like to say I'm proud of the fact that I was alive during the birth of a genre of music, which is hip hop. Hearing the very early stuff, watching how it evolved and everything like that. Do you think that there has been something like that, a big bang for a genre like that since hip hop in the late 70s, early 80s?
Not anything near as cataclysmic. I mean, grunge, certainly, in the early 90s.
But that was kind of derivative, right, of like Stooges and Sabbath It took off from metal and it took off from punk, exactly. It was kind of somewhere a merge of those two things. And actually, one of the anecdotes in the book is hanging out with the Buzzcocks, Pete Shelley, when the Nirvana bassist Chris came backstage for a show. Nirvana had a gig in the area, and he visited the Buzzcocks afterwards. And the people backstage were all flocking over to Chris. He was like, oh, my God, the Nirvana guy's here. And I'm looking at Shelley across the room, and we're exchanging glances, and then he looks at me and he says, so, Jim, is this what we fought the punk wars for? Oh.
And, it was a good question because it was like, well, here we have Nirvana, kind of have ridden that wave and have gotten very, very successful. Buzzcocks helped build that wave. And when he's including me in the conversation, I guess he's me as a writer kind of trumpeting that kind of music. And it led to Nirvana. Well, it's a good question, and unanswerable, actually. And, was it a good thing or a bad thing? Ultimately, I think a good thing. At that point. Anyway, digressing from the question, in terms of other genres that matter to me that much? I honestly can't say so. I don't think so. I know now Spanish language music is incredibly hot, Bad Bunny, etc. Not my world, and I wouldn't pretend to understand it or write about it. Sort of a different generation, and if that's where they want to head, that's fine. That's up to them. But would you concur? Do you see anything post hip hop that?
I don't, and I'm trying not to be a grumpy old man about it, but like,
right.
it wasn't like back in the day, But nothing like you said as culture changing. Grunge was great, and I love a lot of those bands. But like we said, they were kind of still even to me. And I don't know how you feel about this. Even the Ramones, while they were groundbreaking, it was kind of like the Stooges and the MC5 and Blue Cheer were kind of doing that before them. But if you have a band like the Talking Heads or Television, those bands created an entirely new sound that nobody else was really doing at the time. Same thing with hip hop. And even though there were samples from other music, nobody else was doing that. Nothing else sounded like it. So that's kind of my thing.
Right.
It's like there's a whole entirely new sound that was created. And I don't think it's happened since hip hop.
Yeah, I concur with that, and I'm sure there are people who are maybe much more into today's music than you and I are, who would say, oh no, wait a minute, this subgenre or this derivative is just as important, and could be, but it's not. Again, I'm not the person to answer that.
Well, I really enjoyed both the books, Volumes 1, and I'd have to say Volume 2 more because it's more of the music that I'm into. There's some really great stories. I love the chapter on the Cars because I'm a huge Cars fan, and talking to Greg Hawkes and Elliot Easton, who I think was an underrated member of that band for sure. That's a great chapter. And then the one with The Cure, again, that's someone, if I was going into an interview, I'd figure he'd be sitting there with candles and wearing a veil or a hood or something, but I've learned not recently, but eventually I learned that, Robert Smith loves Christmas so much he never tours around that time. So you can't be too gothic.
Right.
Right. But,
well, and the other thing, too, is one thing that's funny about Robert, too, is that the way he looks. I mean, he's built, as he says, kind of like a linebacker.
Right, yeah.
He's not the traditionally thin, wasted, goth-like figure, know.
Yeah.
And he too has a great sense of humor. And it's not. I think this is one of the things I learned very early on is that the people that they are on stage is not at all necessarily who they are off stage. Much like an actor in a role is not the person who is the actor after you talk to them. Yes, there's overlap often. There's continuity, especially if the artist writes their own songs, and especially if those songs come from experience. But the intimidation you might feel or the power that you might feel from somebody on stage, often when the lights are off and they're chilling out backstage, no, it's just decompressing and back to normal.
Right. Yeah, they save it for the stage.
The good chapter actually is on the Police, because I was there early-ish in their career in 1979, and spent a lot of time with them backstage after a gig in Boston, and talking about Sting, talking to Sting about what he had to do to survive, as an actor, as a model, and as a musician back in the early days, and taking some sort of dubious advertisements, taking a very dubious role in a Sex Pistols movie, but basically putting bread on the table. And it's very humbling in a way. They were on the cusp of something very big, and they knew it. But, he was still very much into recalling what went on before the breaks started to happen for them. And it's pretty illuminating, and it's good stuff. We had a good long talk, and then, we caught up again many years later in the same place at the Paradise when he went to see his son, Joe, play in his band. And it was kind of funny. There's a coda that I won't go into right now in the book about that exchange.
Backstage and Beyond Volume 2. Also, please check out Backstage and Beyond Volume 1. They're both great. Jim Sullivan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. Good talking to you as always.